By the way, over there on the table is some books of common prayer. And last week we were handing out to anyone who does not have a book of common prayer that we would like to offer those. Oh, there's, come on in. There's chairs over here. So if you don't have a book of common prayer, please take one. We would love to have it. Do y'all have a book of prayer?
I took one last week.
Okay. And Carla, do you have a prayer book?
No.
Okay, let me get you one of the prayer books here. And actually, I can get a copy of it in French. French and in English. French and Spanish as well.
Wow.
So, please, yeah. So, y'all help remind me to get a French one.
It's also nice to do both. To learn the English version.
Well, and I thought about you because my friend is at the American Cathedral in Paris this Sunday, which is have any of you heard of the American Cathedral in Paris? It's kind of famous. It's been in a couple of movies. How many of you remember Olivia De Havilland?
Yes. Heard of her.
Okay, all of us who are older. It was in the movie Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind.
Oh, yeah.
And she was in that and many other very famous movie stars. She's very, very devout Episcopalian. But she moved to France very early on. She kind of had it with America a little bit and liked the French more open kind of way of many things in life. And so she lived in Paris for about, I think, 45 years. And she was a member of the cathedral in Paris. And it was odd because people would be visiting, going there for vacationing, and they would go, and there's this lady up there reading the epistle, and they're going, she looks like Olivia De Havilland. And people go, that's because it is. So, now, last week we were talking about the outline of faith and the catechism. These are usually just easier for some people because they're an 8.5 by 11. And I have these available. So, let's see, how many of us are here? Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. I think we're fine. Because it's in the Book of Common Prayer in the back, but if you would like one of these copies, because this is one that throughout this, I would like you to you don't have to read it all in one session, and it's not that long, but it would be good for you to go over because it has that sense of, again, in easy question form about all these different areas of our faith as Christians, especially as we seek to live that out as Anglican or Episcopal Christians. So if you want to take one, you can do that, and the clay back there. Okay. Put this off to the side.
Are you sure? Okay.
And then, I didn't bring my clipboard. Last week, and there's the clipboard downstairs in the narthex. Again, the entry area is called the narthex. The table, I have a clipboard for those who are interested in being either baptized, confirmed, or received, or to make an affirmation of faith again. When the bishop comes on May 15th, I'd ask you to sign up. Is there someone here who's considering that who maybe hasn't signed that yet?
What's your receipt?
Okay. See, boy, I think that's going to be a question a lot. That was how we started off last time. It's a good question.
We are baptized in the Catholic church, so we don't know how
No, I know. Now, I know that you've heard, especially as a Roman Catholic, of what it is to be confirmed when you get older. Now, did you go through confirmation?
Yes.
Okay, so you've already been confirmed. Well, that helps answer part of your question, especially since you come from the kind of apostolic tradition of the church. Now, what it is say you're coming to the Episcopal Church and you come from a various traditions, say the Roman Catholic or Methodist, Baptist, whatever it may be, and you're an adult and you have joined. Well, once you if you've been baptized, people say, well, how do I join the church? Let's start there. You come to me and you say, oh, I would like to be a member of St. John's. And I'll go, okay, that's wonderful. First, I'll go like, I'm just curious, have you been baptized? And if you say, yes, I've been baptized, I go, okay, you're a member of the church. And then that means because you've given me permission, I then put in the books, the enrollment, that you are a baptized member of St. John's Episcopal Church, and you're then also a member of the Episcopal Church. Now, and that's what we call baptized members, which is the basis of all membership in the body of Christ, the church throughout the world, anywhere. Okay, but we then also say, as we take our journey in faith, confirmation is for those who were baptized usually as a child. Okay, and they are now ready to make an adult affirmation that is basically, and again, to confirm the promises made at the baptism. So now you're saying as an adult, I will stand up and confirm those vows of baptism as an adult before the bishop, before the church, and the whole world. And so you do that. And so when the bishop comes, we present you as one to be confirmed. And when the bishop goes over and lay hands on you, he asks then for the Holy Spirit to come upon you and to guide you now in your adult faith and doing so, to confirm that sacrament of baptism that was done. Okay? Say you come, you have already been confirmed. Now, in that case, that might be from Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Lutheran. I'm trying to think of the other sacramental churches that have confirmation. That's kind of some of the big ones right there. But say you have already been confirmed, but you're also now coming into the church and you say, well, Jason, yeah, I can see me being a Baptist member, but I want to be like officially received into this church or this communion. So what happens is, say you're a Baptist or a Presbyterian, and say you've made some type of an adult affirmation. You have either as in being baptized as an adult, or you know that I've been living into my faith for years as an adult, and I'm confident that I've made that decision. Then if you're saying you then want to follow that now within the Episcopal Church and throughout the Anglican Communion, you say, I'd like to be received. Because you don't need to be confirmed, because you're living in an adult faith. You just say, I want to be received. And on that, it's a very wonderful thing. So when the bishop receives, first those who are to be confirmed, then when those being received, he also lay hands on, but the prayer is different. He basically says, I recognize you, I think it starts this way, I recognize you as a member of Christ, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And we receive you into this communion. And then he offers this blessing, may God the Father, Son, bless you, keep you. And he basically says, welcome, and ask God to bless you in your journey. And so that's a very wonderful. And the last one is, say you've done all of those, but it's been years and years, something may be stirring in you, and you say, I just would really like to reaffirm my faith publicly. That's called a reaffirmation of faith. And that's where the bishop lays hands and says, may God continue what God has already begun in you and continue that wonderful journey. Now, you can look at all those prayers. If you look in your Book of Common Prayer, the Book of Many Gifts, it has, in the service there, it actually has under what we call the sacramental rites, it has confirmation. And in there, it has the actual prayers, for instance, that the bishop will say when he or she is doing those services. Okay? Hopefully that's a little helpful. And if you're considering those who are being confirmed or received, I do need to get on this some things like I need to get some things like your birth date, where you were born, and also your baptism, if you can remember as close as possible. Even if you don't know the month, the date, if you know the kind of the year, things like that, because we put that within that. And then we have some who are being prepared for baptism. And I'll have to do a couple of things so I get those right for that. And then this is a question, like for your kids, have they already been baptized?
Yes, and I have a question about the
Okay.
because in the Catholic Church we do the First Communion.
First Communion.
And for them, they have been taught for many years about the catechism. And for them, it's very important the day when they will. So they don't want to do that.
And if you notice, this is commonly called the catechism. Right. So the outline of faith is the catechism. And and I know these are good questions. Sorry, we're not getting right into it, but these if say someone comes in, and this has happened many times in parishes. Now, the first thing to acknowledge is it used to be even in the Episcopal Church. Some of you may remember it was very common that kids, even though they were baptized, a lot of times didn't receive communion until they were confirmed. So there was also a pressure to have confirmation very early on, quite often when many kids were not ready to make really a full affirmation of faith. But we're going like, we don't want to wait till they're 15 for them to ever receive communion. Well, it became clear in a lot of that came out of things in the Roman Catholic, the Vatican II, and many of the other things in the 60s and 70s, kind of the liturgical, and when we were reclaiming a lot of the church's early documents that really, we kind of, in the middle of the Middle Ages, kind of got things a little screwy. And one of those was that really the only requirement to receive communion is baptism. Now, we've even gone a step further that in most Anglican churches we say, if you desire the love, mercy, and grace of God, and you have not yet been baptized, but you feel a call to come forward, and I take it again, remember Jesus on the cross. Here he is, dealing with all that he is dealing with, feeling forsaken, and a thief says to him, Lord, he says, will you remember me in your kingdom? Jesus doesn't go, well, if you survive this or something, make sure you go and talk to the local clergy, make sure you're baptized, then be confirmed, and then we'll consider it. He says, today you will be with me in paradise. Okay? There's and actually, if you actually remember, Jesus himself was baptized, but he never baptized anyone. Think about that. But he told his apostles and disciples to go out and do so. Now, there is the normal ways, of course, in which we do things. And it makes sense. If you want to receive communion and be in the full life of the body of Christ, we're told that really it is we come into the fullness of God's household by baptism, which is to be a celebration. It's not because you're evil, bad, or going to hell. It's because God chooses and desires to have a relationship with you. God seeks you out. And actually, growing up as a Baptist, they only had what they called adult baptism. And it was basically kind of understood that the action in baptism was me, because I wanted to try to be saved from going to hell. And there was this whole punitive thing. Whereas actually the action done in baptism, when we watch a baptism, watch the words we say. Everything far as the action that is done is God. We only say yes and receive. God is the one who gives action. God says that I receive you. It's just very clear. This is not about trying to escape hell. It's about saying, I say yes to God. And God always says yes. In fact, at one of the last things we do, after you've been baptized and you're anointed with oil, we say, you are marked as Christ's own forever. And in that, it means it doesn't matter what happens in your life. If one time you say, I've had it, I don't want to have anything to do with God, and I'm going on my own way, and you become kind of that person who strays and goes away, God says that baptism is an indelible mark, meaning you can choose to not accept it, but God will accept and love you no matter what. Because what God makes a covenant is forever. So, yeah.
I can relate to one thing that Carolyn was saying about Caroline Florent's children, because I noticed that they go up and ask for a blessing.
Yeah.
And I have had a dilemma in my own coming to St. John's, in that when I occasionally accompany my wife to Mass at St. Thomas, the Catholic Church, The first couple of times I went up and received communion with her, because we always receive communion as a couple, and because we're sacramental as a married couple. And I have since stopped doing that, because even though I know that the Catholic Mass involves the real presence of the body and blood of Jesus, the Catholic Church teaches that I'm not supposed to receive if I'm not Catholic anymore. And so,
of course, we say you are Catholic, but you're just not Roman Catholic. You're English. You're an English or Anglo-Catholic. Is what you are. And yes, and I know that is a dilemma. When it comes to that, if you're going, we have a lot of Episcopalians say they travel, and there's not an Episcopal church where they are. Quite often, many will either go to a Roman Catholic or the Lutheran Church. Now, the Lutheran Church, generally, it's not going to be an issue because we're in full communion. With the Catholic Church, it depends literally on the diocese and the priest that you're talking to. So far, everywhere I've ever gone where there's Roman Catholic priests there in charge, and they know I'm an Episcopal priest. There was one in Indiana. I was at a monastery, and I just kind of said, and he goes, "Oh, by the way, Mass is at," he says, "it's at noon today on this Friday." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you. I hope." And he goes, "No, you are to be there." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Well, of course you are." And he says, "You're a priest of the church." And I'm like, okay, that's a little different. Now, if I was probably in Rome and stuff, and some of the higher uppers were looking around, they'd be going, no. I didn't say, Technically, they would say no, but what I often find is, and in the end, it has to be a decision of your own heart. Yeah. I know some people who, when they go to the Roman Catholic Church, they would like to receive. And some, where it may have been a place of hurt, where they know that they're not welcome for a lot of different reasons, sometimes say, I choose not to receive, not because I know God receives me, but because I know they don't. And I just don't feel, and it, that's a tough decision, okay? And you have to make that kind of call. But pretty much like if you were at St. Thomas and going, and I know that was your parish. So I would generally always speak to the priest. And of course, I always respect whatever. If they say you are not to, not only will I not, but I then don't want to. Because I'm like going, they're really going to say no? So, okay, that's just a choice there.
Yes, for our kids, it's not a question of am I allowed or not. It's because for them, they have been through a long way of trying of faith and trying to discover Jesus and for them they don't want to do it like a normal day doing that, and they want it to be very special.
Yes. And so what we've done, like I did this in one other parish, there were quite a number of the parents who said, there's some parents who said, my child is baptized, and I mean, I've seen them, less than a year old taking communion. And that is actually perfectly okay. Per the canons of the church, the law says, if you're baptized, go if you wish. But I know that I have a lot of parents, and I also understand this view, who say, I want my children, yes, I know they can receive it, and grace is given to us whether we understand it or not. But at the same time, I also, and I've had, most of them will say that kids will start receiving, not all, but about half of them say, I want them to start receiving, but then I'd like them to get more instructions so that they know as they grow to understand as much as we can understand, okay? And then, or saying also, I want this to be a special time for them in having that. And we can do this even here at St. John's. There can be a point where we have, and say when we kind of get the things going for the kids, say they've gone through some time and I've asked them, say, cover some things about communion. Yeah. Granted, again, I'll diverge a little bit on this, is in the end, I remember very early on, not too long after seminary, somebody was like railing against me saying, kids shouldn't receive communion. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what it's about. And I looked at him, and it was just, I had this one moment of clarity, and I didn't mean to be a smart butt, but I just said, do you or do any of us fully comprehend the whole mystery of what it is? Do you know all about it? Well, I know it's receiving Jesus. And I said, there you go. and I kind of said, I've actually, and right after the next week, this one little kid came up. Now, his grandmother had been preparing him. And so she said, this is going to be your Sunday. Here is this, he was 3 years old, really precocious kid. And he comes, and this is church, during communions, kind of quiet music and everything. He comes up. Now, some may find this cute or not, but he receives the bread. He takes a sip from the cup, and not the grape juice, the wine. And because all of our kids, I've actually, this is the first place I've ever known it's
Grape
used
juice,
grape juice.
yeah.
I've never seen it. And he did it, and then he stopped, and he looked at his grandmother and me, and he goes, I ate the body and bones of Jesus. And he said, and I drank his blood. Like this. He sounded like a Baptist preacher. And I was like going, you know what? He got it. You're right. You sure did. And he kind of did this, I'm like going, I think he got it with more excitement than a lot of times some of us do as adults. So there's that element, but then there's also kind of that preparation. So in a lot of places, if people wish to do that, I say, okay, let's offer something to kind of help. And then let's have a time for those who are wishing to kind of receive their first communion. We do that on a Sunday service, and it's a celebration for everybody, but we bring those kids up first, and we let them know this is a very special day. So I hope that kind of,
Oh, yes.
yeah, because the used to be about First Communion was tied into making sure these kids are at least in step and in line with the teachings of the church, instead of it being more necessarily sometimes about God. But so it's not a bad or a good thing. It's just been part of how we've developed over time. You will notice quite often when a bishop, like if we had, say a 15 or 18-year-old or whatever, or it doesn't matter, say you're an adult or age of consent and you are getting baptized and you've not been, you obviously haven't been confirmed. If you're, and this goes back to the original ancient rite of baptism. When baptism was often during Lent, the people studied the catechism because they were called catechists, people preparing for baptism in the faith. And if it was an adult and the family was being baptized, the adults would learn because they were then responsible for teaching the children that, who were going to be baptized. So what would happen would be then at Easter, either that night with the Easter Vigil or Easter at the morning, then they would be baptized. And after they came out of the water, the bishop, the episkopos, the bishop, Episcopal is the Greek word for bishop. Okay, so that's where we get that word, the church of our bishops, meaning we're apostolic church, we're Catholic, but we just don't have the Roman with it. So they would then, the bishop would then get the oil and anoint them, and that was their confirmation. You were baptized by the priest, and the bishop confirmed what was done, and you as an adult. It was done as one rite. So especially like my bishop in Missouri, whenever we had an adult baptism, the bishop said, oh, it's great, they get 2 for 1. So it's like, because I would baptize, he would then anoint and say, you're confirmed. So originally they were together as one rite. Over time in the Middle Ages, because there were less bishops and because used to bishops were in a smaller area, but they got geographically bigger, the bishop couldn't make it to every baptism. So what they do is they had to wait till the bishop came. That's how we got delayed confirmation. It was all practical, it wasn't spiritual. Okay. So, okay, wow, not too much on that. Yeah, yes.
I just wanted to say, for anybody that might be thinking about it, being confirmed as an adult is a very special thing.
It is, and I know Bishop Ayasi sees this as a very special thing and a celebration. I thought I was going to drop the coffee. And I will be happy to talk to you some more about if you would like to do something so that the kids can have a special thing and to receive communion. So we can do that. And so your question is very good. So, did anyone not get the outline, by the way?
It's from last week. Oh, yeah, I remember.
It's the outline of what we're doing. Okay, how many again? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I had
You
4.
probably said they were on the table, but I didn't grab one.
Okay. Can I make one copy for you afterwards?
Sure.
Because I just have 4.
Sure.
And I'm not picking on you, but you were talking so much. And let's see.
Thank you.
And, I promise you will not be left. So you can kind of see. So today what we're going to do kind of quickly, and this is stuff you could spend at least 5 weeks on what we're doing today, but obviously we just don't have the time to do that. But that can be for follow-up times of maybe having some follow-up discussions about those. So, again, I'm not leaving. So again, our Anglican or Episcopal Church heritage and history, and the second, structure and governance. And when people, if you want to use the church terms, when we're talking about how are we governed, how do we make decisions, and that's called the polity, your governance of how it's church and how we're organized. And you'll notice it's in that order of the Anglican Communion, then the Episcopal Church, then the diocese, and then congregations, which are parishes and missions. Okay, I'm going to send, while I'm talking, some things around. The first one is a handout that kind of starts in the order we're talking about. This is about Anglicanism. What is Anglicanism? Beginnings, the Church of England, principles of it, and then also some statistics like the Anglican Communion. And it tells you what is it, what's the Church of England, what's the Archbishop of Canterbury, all that kind of stuff, and then the organizational kind of what the Episcopal Church is. So take one of those and pass that around. And I think we have more than enough copies. There's another one that's just a smaller one that talks about, we say the Anglican Communion, and I'm going to say something about that in just a moment, but we say what are the instruments, what are the things that we use that guides us about what does it mean, our communion, what makes us all in communion together. And it has the areas of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lambeth Conference, you'll see this, it looks like the primates, and it's usually said primate, but it's primates, and a bishop is a primate, okay? Or actually, excuse me, what am I saying? The primate is the senior bishop of a province. The Episcopal Church is a province of the Anglican Communion, and they're almost always nationally for the country. So the primate of our church is the presiding bishop. They're always a bishop. And in our country, because we still have that thing about with this American, we say presiding bishop instead of archbishop. So now in Canada, in the Anglican Church of Canada, it's the archbishop. Okay, and there's only one archbishop because he or she then is, and it's kind of considered a first among equals. It's the bishop that is chosen to be the spokesperson, the voice, and the spiritual guide kind of for that church and to speak to things, okay? And then there's the Lambeth Conference. I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then some of the other things that are with that. Okay, so I'll send that around. All right. And I know these are a lot, but just put them in a stack and all these. But I just want to give, because there's so much we don't cover that in some of the detail, that I'll give this to you, and hopefully some of these will cover. Most all of these are short, so this is something you can do and know, like, oh, I'm not reading a 700-page, book on all this. This next one is just a fact sheet on the Episcopal Church in the United States of America, some of the origins and about American bishops, and on it even talks about, has a section on missions to the West, that's us, and then vocations of women and ecumenical areas as well. So take that one. Pass it around. And then this one is one that I alluded to. This will help you. So last week somebody said, what's a diocese? Remember I said that's a geographical area within our church in which a bishop has jurisdiction over that includes so many congregations. In the Diocese of Utah, I think there are 37, 38 congregations that are some are parishes, some are missions. And then there's the bishop, and then there's diocesan structures and so forth. This is a map of the United States where it shows, like here's Utah. Okay, so and that's called the Diocese of Utah. Now, like where I grew up in Louisiana is split. There's the Diocese of Louisiana, but then there's the Diocese of Western Louisiana. And that's the part of Louisiana I lived in. So you can look anywhere and find out what diocese it is. You will notice in this map, though, you will see these Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, all the way through 9. These are called the provinces within the Episcopal Church, where you take like the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, the Deep South, the Midwest, all this. And what they do is they group them together. So again, it's always, you'll notice you have this big thing and we start doing like this, because obviously you can't do everything on the national level. You've got to do things then regionally, then to your diocese, then to your parish and all of that. On the back side, this one's fun. This will give you a major headache. The canonical structure of the church. Canonical meaning the legal. Canon is like the law. A canon is a law of the church. And so this shows how we are set up. And there's a real uniqueness about how the Episcopal Church is set up. I'm going to pass that around. I'll go ahead and just tell you that. The Episcopal Church came about, it really started what we call the Anglican Communion. First of all, the word Anglican. Anybody know? Anybody kind of go like, I don't know what that means? Okay. It really comes from, in the sense, in England or in Britain, the word Anglican, England, it came from basically meaning English. So if you're an Anglican, it means an English Christian. Now, that isn't always the case. There's a lot of Anglicans who aren't English speaking or English at all. In fact, there's more people of color in the Anglican Communion than us Caucasians. We are actually the minority worldwide. Not in America or in Britain or places like that. Although we've seen the Episcopal Church change a lot in its makeup. Look at our presiding bishop, African American from North Carolina. Okay, there was a time where no one would ever thought we would have an African American presiding bishop or anything. His family goes all the way back to, they've traced the slaves. His mother was actually, there's an ancient, there was, do you know the first, anyone know who the first African American who was ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church?
Not you two.
No. Well, he's in the Church of South Africa. Is Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones, now get this, in the United States, he was ordained a priest in the 1780s. Can you imagine the stir even in the New England? Black man. But our church has usually said, even when we're not ready, we're going to say we know it's right and we're going to try to do it. You know, and so Absalom Jones, to this day, he was Philadelphia, there's St. Thomas Episcopal Church. It is a massive, to this day, very large Episcopal church in Philadelphia that is primarily African American to this day. And it has been there for almost 200 years as a testament to part of his ministry. And there are historically, unfortunately, we are becoming much more integrated, but historically, if you look in a lot of places, especially in larger cities, there's like in St. Louis, where I was, there was all these parishes in the city, but then there was All Saints. All you had to do was say All Saints, and you go, and everybody would say, that used to say, oh, that's the black parish. And it was all African American. And historically, you had those, because usually they were separate, which we go like, why? But there's a lot of reasons. Some, not all are bad. Some are good, and some are also some of the reasons they chose at that time, because there really wasn't much other types of integration to that. So we do have that type of changes, but the Episcopal Church and that structure there that you see, you can kind of see how we're divided up. Now, remember, the reason we exist, and I said we started the Anglican Communion because before the Episcopal Church, there was only the Church of England. Well, there was also the Church of Wales and the Scottish Episcopal Church. Now, those all make up the early British Anglican churches. But when, you remember when at least the original colonies were settled, that was by Britain. And so the church, basically all of these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of churches and colonies, they didn't call it St. John's Episcopal Church. It was just called St. John's Parish or St. John's Church, because it was the established church of the people who did those colonies. All of a sudden then, oops, we had a Revolutionary War with England. Well, whoops. You can't say, well, we're the Church of England when we're no longer England, can you? And there was like, well, that probably isn't good because everybody's ticked off at them and they ain't too happy with us either. So you had the problem then at the end of the Revolution. They thought the church as we know it was just going to fall apart. And there for a while, like the priests didn't know, like, because priests at that time had to take allegiance to the queen or the king. Well, we're in America now. So they quickly, some of the leaders began to gather in Philadelphia. Some of these people were also very instrumental in writing our Constitution. And if you ever look at the structures of the Episcopal Church, it follows the structure of the American governance. It's by a lot of the same people. So they would meet at Independence Hall a lot of times in places like that in Philadelphia. They would go down the street to Christ Church, Philadelphia, and then started putting together the Constitution of the Episcopal Church. Now, when it was founded, it was called the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. Because at that time, Episcopal was still only seen as a word associated with Roman Catholics. So they used the word saying, well, we embrace Protestant reform, but we are also Catholic. So Protestant Episcopal. It's later the Protestant has been kind of officially dropped. But there's also, anybody else know the other legal name of our church? It's an interesting one. So we have Episcopal Church. We are also legally on paper, if you receive things from the national church, you are receiving them from the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society of America. The Episcopal Church was found, and they saw themselves as missionaries. So our legal name entered in was the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. Doesn't sound very Anglican, does it? But it was at that time. So if you ever see these initial DFMS, that's the short acronym for the Church, Domestic Foreign Missionary Society. Okay, and it is still used in some places. Okay. So what they did is at the end of the the Revolutionary War, they gathered together and said, we got to come together and figure this out. Also, the colonies in America had a very, very small number of priests, because remember, only a bishop can ordain a priest. So, but England took very much, remember, church and government wasn't always so separate. As they wanted to keep control on these colonies, they purposely never let us have a bishop because that would give us greater independence to do things. So and at that time only men, any man who wanted to be a priest in the United States had to do a 50-50 chance of survival. They would have to get on a ship, go back to England, get ordained by a bishop, then get on the boat and come back and hope they didn't die on the journey there to or from. And about only half of them made it. It literally was a 50-50 if you made it. So you had to be pretty passionate about this. So at the end, we just ended this war. We lost the connections. And these clergy and lay leaders said, what are we going to do? Now, in Canada, it was a little different because you were still under the crown. Still are. And when I was in Newfoundland, every Sunday, we always prayed for the Queen. So we did. And which is good. We should probably pray for all the leaders. So what they said is, they said, well, okay, what are we going to do? Well, they said, well, we got to try to get a bishop. So they contacted the House of Bishops in England and said, if we send a prepared candidate, we have 2 priests of our church leaders, William White of Philadelphia and Samuel Seabury of Connecticut. They are being called to be our bishops. Will you ordain them? And I said, are you kidding? Are you kidding? I was kind of not no, but hell no. It was like, we just ended a war, and now you're upstart, just, they still feel that way about Americans. Americans. And they were like, no, we won't do it. So, but we were smart. Conquered it. We all know that the Scottish and the English do not have always a real good history of just being the best of friends. So they said, the Scottish Episcopal Church, they have apostolic succession. Why don't we ask them? And so what they did is they contacted the Scottish House of Bishops and said, well, the English said no. Would you like to ordain the first American bishop? And they were like, oh, yeah. They're like, ha, 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 stick it to the English. And the English bishops. So Samuel Seabury was sent to Aberdeen, Scotland on a ship. And not all, but most of the bishops gathered in the late 1700s, laid hands on Samuel Seabury in Aberdeen, Scotland, and consecrated him our first bishop and sent him back to America. Well, guess what? Word got to the English House of Bishops, and they're like, we will not be outdone by the Scottish. Send us that other guy. Isn't it amazing how the English it was a little change of heart. We're not going to be outdone by those Scots. So William White gets on a boat and heads over to London. Well, then the House of Bishops then laid hands on him, ordained him bishop. So they both come back to America. Any of you, downstairs we have the Episcopal Flag. Any of you ever really looked at it? So it's a white background with a red cross of St. George. That is the flag of England. If you notice in the corner, kind of like the American flag, there's a blue banner area with white little crosses that do like this. So it's a blue background with white like this. What is that? It's the cross of St. Andrew, which is the patron saint of Scotland, and that white on the blue is the Scottish flag. So it's the English flag with the Scottish flag imposed upon it, and those white little crosses that make up that bar are the exact number of the original founding diocese of the American Church. So it's kind of really it's a wonderful symbol of who we are, that our roots come from both Scotland and England in our roots. So today, many, both bishops and even priests, can trace their apostolic line either to the English line or the Scottish line. And mine is both. The bishop who ordained me was actually from England, but he moved to America. So he was an American who was originally from England. So he didn't get ordained by the English, so he had the Scottish line even though he was English. So I always like to remind him of that. So the American Church then said, okay, how are we going to govern? They said, we kind of got a good idea going on in America. Let's see how that works. So if you look, we have a president, we have the executive branch, then we have, and I know civics needs to be taught in our schools. That's a sidebar saying, since a lot of people don't really understand how America works. But then, you have the executive branch, then you have the Congress, the legislative branch, and then, of course, the Supreme Courts and so forth in that branch, okay? Now, what they did is they said, okay, well, there's a president, and mainly then you have a Congress that has House of Representatives and a Senate. Well, they said, our Archbishop will be called the presiding bishop, president, and the General Convention of the Episcopal Church will meet every 3 years, and it has, since the late 1700s, since 1789, has met every 3 years to govern, to make decisions, to resolutions and canons or governance. and they meet in two houses. The House of Deputies, which is like the House of Representatives, which is half priests and deacons, and the other half is laity. Then we have the House of Bishops, the Senate, which is made up of all the bishops of the American Church. All legislation comes to both houses and must be passed by both. Sound familiar? And then the person who then presides over the House of Bishops is the presiding bishop. And then you have a president over the House of Deputies. And then, so it works kind of in this way, all right? And then, so that's the overall governance. But then you've got, then what happens there? And that's where on these charts here that you'll see kind of this guide. What then happens is we then go to, let me back up one thing. When we talk about the Anglican Communion, like I said, we kind of founded it because all of a sudden there was a church that wasn't really the Church of England in America or Church of England here and there. It was actually governed separate. But we actually then, on our first Book of Common Prayer, the American Anglicans then said, well, we need a Book of Common Prayer. Of course, we're Anglican. So the first Book of Common Prayer, and I'll bring some in when we get to this, I've actually got a copy of the first American prayer book from 1789, found it in my Baptist grandparents' house. I don't know how I got there, but it was there. I think she was maybe a secret Anglican. I don't know. But so that, and there's been different. There's a 1789 American prayer book, 1852, then 1928, which some people who are really old still say that's the only prayer book, you know, and because they call the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, they refer to it as the New Prayer Book, and I'm like, I don't know about how many of you say 1979 is new, but so that's the one. So the American Church kind of said, okay, well, there's somebody's not in the Church of England. Well, then all of a sudden Canada received independence. So you had, okay, so it's the Anglican Church of Canada. They have their own Book of Common Prayer. Then all of a sudden Australia, Anglican Church of Australia, they have their own Book of Common Prayer. New Zealand. And a lot of you know about the New Zealand prayer book. It's very popular in the Anglican Communion. And then, so all of a sudden this started happening all over the globe. So today we have, it used to be 70, it's now close to 80 million Anglicans around the world, okay, in the Anglican Communion. We all share the same heritage. We all have a Book of Common Prayer in our language that meets the people and culture of where we live and serve. And we all have the same basic tenets of faith. And but we still look back to Britain is in our history and heritage. Okay, so you have this communion, and then in the Anglican Communion, the one who is looked upon as the spokesperson for the communion, and also specifically for the Church of England, is the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's as close as we get to a pope. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, his title is described as the first among equals. It means he has no more authority than any other bishop, but the other bishops grant the Archbishop of Canterbury the privilege and status to be that leader and spokesperson. Okay? And so that's kind of how that works. And in the ancient church, actually, you can get back to a little church history. If you remember in the early church that Rome and Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, became the two big centers of Christianity as it moved out of Palestine and Judea and was moving around. And there kind of became a power struggle between Constantinople and Rome. The bishop in Rome, of course, you still have the Roman Empire. It makes kind of sense. It's the seat of all the authority. It's the big capital. Well, the Bishop of Rome did kind of have a real big status. And of course, and then as well as the Bishop of Constantinople, which became eventually known as the Patriarch. And the Bishop of Rome became known as the Pope. But they are all still the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople. And even today, within Roman Catholic terminology, for those who are in the Vatican, the Pope is also still referred to as the Bishop of Rome. And Anglicans refer to him as the Bishop of Rome, our brother Bishop of the Bishop of Rome, and is respected as such. Papacy, in our understanding today, came much, much later. There was a sense they did call them a pope, meaning the head father. But this whole thing about infallibility and all that kind of stuff, That was not part of it. Also, do you know for at least the first 800 years of life in the Vatican that almost all popes had wives and children? You know, I mean, today people go, what? Your average Roman Catholic would be like, really? But it's Gregory the Great came along much later with this novel because he just loved monasticism. And he just said, you know what? Everybody should be celibate if you're a priest. And all these other priests are going, oh, great. And, of course, it was imposed. They didn't have any choice. Yeah?
Is that the same Gregory that was it a feast yesterday or?
That was Gregory of Nyssa.
Oh.
It's a different. He's kind of an Orthodox, Eastern Christianity. So you had that kind of going on in Rome, and that was kind of the seat of more Western Christianity at this point in Europe. And then what happened, the very first division in the church was in 1000 AD, when this kind of really stupid, silly infighting, which is always what happens out of things when we have divisions in the church. The Pope in Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople, these two bishops decided we don't like each other and we want to be in charge. So what did they do? They excommunicated each other.
Wow.
And therefore, in 1000 AD, all Christians in the eastern part of the world and all the western were never more to be one. What ridiculous. You know, and so there are millions and millions, of course, of Eastern Orthodox Christians who, it's similar, we're all part of that Catholic universal church, but they follow a more Eastern way of thinking about a lot of things, okay? And today, unfortunately, we still see some of the silliness. I mean, I will say, like, Pope Francis has shown great graciousness when he is, just this past year, went to the Eastern, and see, you would never go to their place on their terms. It's all this arrogance we had. But he said, I will come to you. And he came to these Eastern churches in Eastern Europe, and I think even in Ukraine before all this happened. And he came and he said, on behalf of Rome, I want to ask your forgiveness for the past sins of division that we have contributed to. Now that is a sign of Christianity. Reconciliation, forgiveness. And for the most part, he was kind of given the finger. Unfortunately, where he went, there was actually angry rioters outside of the one Eastern bishop's residence when the Pope went there, who said, excommunicate, burn him at the stake, and all this, the Pope. But he did not, he graciously went. And now the leader said, this is a big step. You have come to us and asked for forgiveness. Unfortunately, they did not also ask for forgiveness from the Pope for what they had done. But it's in the making. So there's a little bit. So you have that first division that comes. There is then building as the Christianity just soars throughout all of Europe. You have, of course, then the beginnings of what happens in a Reformation. There are those who, many of the earliest reformers had no intent of starting new churches. That was not their desire at all. It was just saying, we have added so much and kind of got lost up in minutia, we forgot the basics of our ancient apostolic and Catholic faith. So you had those who sought to reform it. Martin Luther and what he did was very Catholic. It was, he had no intention of a Lutheran church being formed. But unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is when the people that have to make the decision to accept reform won't accept it, some people finally give up in their patience. Okay, and we understand that. So you then have things like the Lutheran churches, and then you have all the part of the other John Calvin and the Calvinistic churches like the Dutch Reformed and some of those other churches that began. So then in the Reformation in continental Europe, the mainland, you start having these major divisions happening. They just start stacking on. And of course, it's a horrible time because those who are now being called Protestants, it was meant originally as a derogatory term, but of course they said, okay, well, we'll take that term and own it. And they condemned the Roman Catholics, and the Roman Catholics condemned them, and you guess what happens from there. And back then it led to horrible things that are a horrible stain on the church of, killings, executions, excommunication, all that stuff that we all know. Now, it's a dark period, but sometimes understanding what happens and why that happened is important. And remembering that history and the way the church then is not necessarily the way the church operates today, fortunately, in many places. Because so many times the state or the rulers also claimed ownership of the church. Therefore, you've got a lot of messiness going on there. In Britain, though, the Reformation, because at that time, remember, the English Channel made a big difference. You didn't play, it wasn't like today. You didn't go on the Channel and go over, it was different. And there was no interest. There wasn't a great interest in a lot of what the reformers. They're going like, oh, they're creating a mess in France and Belgium and everywhere else, and we don't want to have anything to do with that. So a lot of people say, oh, well, Henry VIII founded the church. Okay, let's just talk about that elephant in the room. People like to say, and that's a fanciful thing. The one truth in that is Henry VIII broke ties as the government, saying, I am the king of England, and I've had enough. What he said was, you no longer have jurisdiction over England. And what happened, and this is important to know, at least in part of our history, okay? When Henry VIII, and remember, at that time, kings and rulers, everything that was established about their continuity was an heir. You had to have, and it usually meant a son, if possible, to then carry your lineage to then be the next king, because you didn't want a different family coming in and claiming over after all you've done. So he's of the Tudor family, the Tudor line, and there's a long line of Tudors, of course, that go. The current one today are Windsors, of course. Now, so Henry, it was very common in that time, in the 1500s, it was not uncommon throughout all of Europe, all these hundreds of kings and queens and stuff, if they couldn't have children by the spouse, the Pope granted divorces like that. Now, a lot of us just don't know the history of that. That was very common. So now your average person, again, that was only reserved for royalty, and it was only for one reason, because the Pope understood if I want to keep them in line and everything, I need to get them to be happy, and that means they got to have an heir for the throne. So Henry VIII, he doesn't have any kids. And he's like he petitions the Pope for a divorce. Well, it just so happens that Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, she's from Spain. Her brother is Philip, the King of Spain, who also happens to be at that time the Holy Roman Emperor. He just happens to have an army of around 10,000 camped outside in Rome, outside the gates of the Vatican. So he gets a letter from Henry saying, I want to divorce Catherine, who's Spanish, whose brother has an army outside my wall. So Henry, the Pope is going, well, this, if there's been other circumstances, he'd go like, okay, here's your divorce. Okay, get another one so you can have a kid. Get this over with. So what happens, though, is he delays. He doesn't say no, but he doesn't say yes. The Pope, he keeps delaying and delaying, hoping that Philip and his army will go away. They don't go away. So he just never will answer. And finally, Henry, he was a little impetuous himself and kind of a narcissist, said, I've had it. I got to rule my kingdom. I don't need the Pope telling me what I can do about my own family. So he just says, okay, you don't have authority here anymore. I take over. And in that, the political tie was broken. But worship in the churches of all of Britain didn't change one single bit. There was no great reform when Henry did this. Henry was do you know that the Pope, not too long before that, granted him a title that is still considered a title of the monarch of England, but it was bestowed first upon Henry VIII because of his faithfulness as a Catholic. The Pope granted him the title Defender of the Faith. And so he was a good Catholic Christian. So, but now, that we have this rift. So, and it never was healed. So eventually, though, there was some of that reform kind of coming into Britain at that time. And you have some of the early English reformers beginning to say, we need to look at what it is that the church should be embracing. Now, there was, compared to the mainland of Europe, English Reformation was very, very mild, even though there was not some mild moments, mild to what happened in the mainland. So what happened then in 1543, the Archbishop of Canterbury was considered kind of the spiritual lead then of England, and then was then said, you know what? They began to, at that time, saying, we have some tenets that we believe are important of what they said of regaining our Catholic faith. And they said, unlike some reformers who want to throw the baby up with the bathwater, they're saying, we are not going to start the church over from new, but we're going to take what it is and just reform that into what was tended to be the more ancient practice. He said, so here's some of those basic tenets of Anglican Reformation. One was that the liturgy, the worship, should be in the language of the people. 2, the scriptures should be also available in the language of the people and be made available to them. 3rd, the laity should receive communion in both kinds, both in the bread and the cup. Remember, they didn't, okay, in most cases. And that celibacy is optional. There are orders of monks and nuns, and we still have them today, but those are people who choose that because they feel it's a calling. But that is not the original Catholic way. So priests, bishops, and deacons do not have to be celibate. So there was that one. Made a lot of clergy happy. And then there's some other ones here. So basically, now, almost all of the basic reforms that were the initial ones in England have all been adopted now by the Roman Church. Okay, so remember at the time, everything had to be in Latin. Now, you go to a Roman Catholic Church, it's in English. You go to a Roman Catholic Church today, the laity receives the bread and the wine. But back then, at that time, that's why you had monstrances and all that, because they would put the consecrated in there and show it to the people, because they didn't get to receive it. Okay? And that's why often Sanctus, I'm getting into another area, Sanctus bells were often rang because these people didn't have a clue what was going on during the Mass. So they would okay, this is important. Pay attention. Now's the time to look up. Ding. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, okay, they're consecrating it now. That's where it originally kind of came from, in that sense, during that time. So you had these things happening. So Anglican Reformation was based on the internet. There's some who wanted it more radical, and some who wanted it even less than what we did. And so there began that transition. Now here's some of the history here. Okay. Part of the history of what happened in Britain that brought us our Anglican faith is who we are today as Anglican Christians was formed in 2 basic ways as far as our spirituality. You had, from the north mainly, Celtic Christianity began to just flourish and explode. Celtic Christianity is very old and was in Britain way before any Roman Catholic mission from Rome came to Britain. So you had the Celtic Christians, where they mainly were getting all of their training in 2 places that today are still considered these holy places. There's Lindisfarne, which is on the east coast, right near the border of Scotland and England, on your way to France, if you keep swimming. And so that was called Holy Isle, Lindisfarne. On the west coast, further north in Scotland, is the island of Iona. In Iona today, when you go there, there is the full restoration of the abbey there that is around 1,500 years old and has been training people in the faith and to missionize the people of Britain since then. Okay, there are those ancient Celtic crosses there. Celtic crosses come from, they didn't just invent those one day. There was already the Druidic kind of just basic, what we call Celtic stuff that was pre-Christian, which they had stones. And I mean, look at Stonehenge. And so many, if you go to Scotland today, there's a lot of circle stones and things that are still there. In some places, what they did, the early Celtic Christians would then say, well, these stones were meaningful to you. What they did is they then carved them into the shape of a cross. And if you look at it, there's all these things carved on it. Those are carvings to tell a story. They would come up and say, the cross, they would explain the cross, and then, okay, here's Jesus doing this, and they would use it in the same way that they already did. You incorporated what you already knew, and it became who you were, okay? And so you had the Celts there, and they were coming in, and they were going back and forth between England and Scotland and Ireland, going back and forth, and they were kind of also coming down to the north of England and spreading. So you had that established Christianity. Celtic bishops, for instance, I'll give you an example of the difference between some of the styles. Celtic bishops had, authority of a bishop and a pastoral thing, but they emphasized humility. Of course, the main way of traveling then was by horse, but Celtic bishops would not ride a horse. They would walk with it and put their supply on the horse, but they said, I'm to emulate Christ. Only rulers and the important people ride the horse. I am supposed to walk and show the example of Christ himself. So you will see, if you go and look, it'll show a lot of Celtic bishops standing next to a horse because they wouldn't ride. In fact, St. Cuthbert, one of my favorite saints, traveled, they estimate, probably close to 3,000 miles in his ministry, walking across Britain. And they did that. Also, they didn't, all this stuff about having the fancy chair, and they didn't do all that stuff. It was a lot different. And there was a lot of the embracing of the world, the cosmos, and that we find God in all the elements and in the creatures. Again, there's this thing of it's a really earthy type of Christianity. Then you had St. Augustine. The story is how he ended up coming to Canterbury in Kent, southern England, is he was in Rome, and he was close to the Pope at the time, and there was some slaves being brought in through the streets, and there were these really fair-skinned young boys who also kind of had light-colored hair, and the Pope saw and said, who are they? Who are these people? And what was said to him is like, they are Angles. And he said, well, they may be Angles, but they look like angels to me. And he said, therefore, we shall send the gospel of Christ to them. So he pulled together Augustine and said, go to England, Angleland, and bring Christianity to them. Augustine took off and he landed in Canterbury today, which is southeastern England. And he got there, and so he said, well, I'll go meet the local king and queen. Well, he got in there and he says, I'm here, and he introduced him. And the king goes, well, I don't know what you think of my wife's a Christian. Now, the king had not converted yet, and Augustine says, what do you mean your wife's a Christian? How did she find out about it? I'm the first one to bring Christianity here. He goes, no, you're not. Sorry about that. But he then said, but he then started from southern England and then, did an incredible mission thing. And then, of course, Canterbury Cathedral was built and all this. And he was the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay. So you had this influx of Roman Christianity that had great structure, organization, all of that. I mean, they were Rome. They were from Rome. The empire knew how to do things. Then you had Celtic Christianity, which was very warm and loving, but, didn't have the greatest structure and was a little kind of loosey-goosey on things. So what happened was they began to see that there was a conflict. And this is what I'll end with, and we'll follow up some more next week on some details. But again, giving you this, our history, the kind of where we really came from, you look at a lot of things both politically and spiritually. So you then had this thing they're going, well, how are we going to do this in Britain? How's Christianity going to work? We got the Celtic and we got the Roman. What do we do? So they said, well, let's call a council together and get together. So they had the Council of Whitby. Now, here's an amazing thing. The Council of Whitby which kind of had that decision purpose. They brought the southern, more English bishops of Roman style and the more northern bishops of the Celtic all together and said, we're going to make this decision. And the person who presided over it, anybody know? A woman. Think about this. This is very early on. We're talking about in the 400s. Okay? Hilda was an abbess over an abbey there of women. And so she was looked upon as a great spiritual leader and a person who knew how to make peace. And so she presided. Now you got to remember back then, because she was more of the Celtic thing, women had a high place in the leadership of the Church of Celtic. Women who were abbesses, like an abbot over Munster, they wore mitres like a bishop. Oh, well, so here she is. She's the one presiding over this. And they had the people present the cases for both. And in the end, what they just said is, you know, we really love this Celtic thing, and we don't think we should have to give that up in our spirituality. But I have to admit, Augustine made a really good case. Nobody can beat that structure and organizing. So what they did is they said, we will go under the structure and the governance, and we will submit to the governance of Rome. But we will still allow our Celtic expression. So that's how then we became under Rome at that time. And then that's how we became under the authority of the bishop. So they granted that. That's very early on. Then later on, you get Henry VIII. And then really, again, the person who makes really the decision, people say, well, Henry VIII he had a political thing and all that kind of stuff. Henry didn't care about spirituality. He just cared about having a kid. But his daughter, Elizabeth I, is the one who really helped decide how we were going to govern and how we were going to be. So you had all these people who were then getting extreme Reformation, and they said, well, we should be Catholic, or no, we should just be Protestants. And she had enough. And she said, there will be the Church of England for all of England. And what they called the Elizabethan Compromise. She really decided how we were going to go. She said, listen, one of her famous comments was this, I don't know, nor do I desire to know the secret thoughts of men, whether they be Catholic-minded or Protestant-minded. But she says, but there will be one church where both will be able to live in who they are. But they, in other sense, better get over themselves and start realizing we're going to be in the same church. And so she said, we're not going to split this up. One Church of England for all the people of England, no matter what your thoughts are. And that's the way it was. And then we had the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, the very first one. Now I'm going to stop there, and then we can take up a little bit next week just on a one last part of the American thing, and then move forward from there. Yes?
One comment, one question. In my journey here at St. John's, I ran across a book that I think other people might like. It's called Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, Celtic Wisdom for Reawakening to What Our Souls Know and Healing the World. And it's John Philip Newell. I don't know if that's familiar, but I was fascinated by it. I don't know very much about Celtic spirituality.
It's a thing that's becoming very, it's a resurgence now in the church of embracing that.
And then a question is, in the United States there are AME churches.
Yes.
So we're Episcopals in there, right?
Yeah. Do you know actually also the United Methodist Church today? Of course, they came from the Anglican churches, okay? In the United States, the official name of the United Methodist Church is the Methodist Episcopal Church. They're Episcopal, they have bishops and everything, but they follow the old, what they call the Methodist way of doing that. Now they then, like today when you go to First Methodist Church in downtown Shreveport, it says, carved into the stone, because it's such an old church, it says First, doesn't say United, it says First Methodist Church -South. Because at the Civil War, the Methodist Church split, North and South. They did not come back together until 1967. over 100 years to rift the Civil War. And so that's how you got the name the United Methodist Church. That's because they reunited. And then the African Methodist Episcopal Church came directly from some of the people who worked with Angeline Jones and some of the others got tired of waiting on the Episcopal Church to take the next steps. And so what they did is some of them felt that they really wanted a church for the black people in America, many of them who were now coming out of slavery at the end of the Civil War. So they started their own, basically they said it's the black version of the Episcopal Church, and they wanted it to be their own, so they call it the African Methodist Episcopal. So that's where it comes from. And we do have a good relationship with them. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you.